Picture, if you will, the scene. It's March 1977. The movies Rocky and Network just cleaned up at the Academy Awards. Your friends are pretty excited about this flick Star Wars that's about to come out. Your favorite video game is Breakout on the Atari 2600. Every time you turn on the radio, you hear Barbra Streisand singing that song from A Star is Born. Boy, you hope they never remake that movie. Your main hobby, of course, is playing Dungeons & Dragons with your friends. Original D&D, that is. There's a kid down the street who just got advanced Dungeons & Dragons, but you don't think it's going to stick. You while away the hours drawing maps on graph paper or sketching cool new swords and reading the newly published Dragon magazine. Issue 5 has just been released, and in addition to some rules for witchcraft in D&D, some add-ons for the sci-fi game Metamorphosis Alpha, a short story by Gardner Fox, the guy who invented The Flash and Batgirl, and some extra rules for high-level magical research, there's an article written by Bill Seligman entitled Gandalf Was Only a 5th-Level Magic User. It's a pretty funny list of all the stuff that Gandalf does in The Lord of the Rings, with every spell mapped to its D&D equivalent. And it turns out that this guy can't even cast Bigby's Forceful Hand, never mind Mordenkainen's sword. You close the magazine because it's Tuesday, and Happy Days is about to start on ABC, and you can't imagine, in that moment of innocence, that people will still be arguing about that article 48 years later, using unfathomable technology that could be used for so much good, but is primarily used for correcting strangers on Reddit. Welcome to Shire Reckoning. I'm Alistair Stevens. This week, how do we understand magic in Middle-earth? Because, as Seligman playfully acknowledges at the end of the article, the link to which is in the show notes, D&D is a bad system for measuring the magical power of Gandalf the Grey, let alone Gandalf the White. And so much of the fantasy that comes thereafter is going to draw on the technical nature of the D&D spellcasting system. They will be hard magic systems, as author Brandon Sanderson will much later call them. And perhaps part of the reason that we swing so hard toward technical, defined, rigorous, structural magic systems in our fantasy fiction is that Tolkien never gives us insight into how and why magic works in Middle-earth, or even what it is. So if we're going to try to build a comprehensive schematic by which we can understand magic as it is presented to us, the first thing we have to acknowledge, as is so often the case, is that Tolkien's stories are first recorded by the residents of Middle-earth themselves, by elves and by hobbits, and that limited perspective sometimes creates an inescapable ambiguity. It's possible that some of the things which are presented to us as magic are simply the product of unknown but completely natural or scientific processes or techniques. Consider Gandalf's fireworks. Are they magical, or are they the product of chemistry and craft? When commemorating Gandalf the Grey in Lothlorien, Sam appends a stanza to Frodo's song. Quote, "The finest rockets ever seen, they burst in stars of blue and green, or after thunder golden showers come falling like a rain of flowers." End quote. Which sounds impressive, but not explicitly magical. Or maybe only magical in the way that all fireworks are kind of magical. We can extend this question too, I guess, to encompass the fire of Orthanc used by Saruman's forces at Helm's Deep. Can only wizards make explosives in this world? Could a curious and enterprising hobbit lass gather together potassium nitrate and sulfur and charcoal and start a rival fireworks business? Alternatively, consider the secret door on the side of the Lonely Mountain, where the keyhole is revealed in the last light of Durin's day. Magic, or just dwarf technology? Certainly, it seems as though there's an aspect of prophecy involved, and we'll talk about that in a minute. But the door itself? Is it magical or just well-made? What about Mithril, like Bilbo's vest? Is that magical, or does it just seem magical to untrained eyes? What about the voice of Saruman? Is he magically manipulative, or just an extremely perceptive, skilled, and ruthless liar? I don't have any clear answers on these for what it's worth, and your mileage will certainly vary. After all, to paraphrase Clark, sufficiently advanced magic is indistinguishable from technology. As readers, I think there's a spectrum of interpretation. At one end, there's the most skeptical position, where only explicitly magical effects are magic and everything else can be explained in more mundane terms, a low fantasy approach. On the other hand, everything is magic, from the moon letters on Thror's map to the clock on Bilbo's mantle. Without more proof from the text, where you draw the line is a matter of interpretation and personal preference. But in most cases, you're going to end up with at least some things in the legendarium which seem magical. And I think, after some careful study and a lot of thought, that these break down into 5 distinct areas. The first, and the category which can be crossed off the list with the most ease, might be considered divine magic, the direct intervention of Eru Iluvatar, the hand of God. We can't really quantify this kind of magic because Iluvatar is omnipotent and can do what he wants. We know that he creates the universe, for example. We know that he gives life to the dwarves created by Aule. We know that he destroys Numenor and reshapes the world toward the end of the Second Age. Tolkien says that it's Iluvatar himself that resurrects Gandalf after the battle with Durin's Bane. He writes in letter 156 to Robert Murray, quote, "The wizards, as such, had failed. Or if you like, the crisis had become too grave and needed an enhancement of power. So Gandalf sacrificed himself, was accepted and enhanced, and returned." End quote. So, as I said, Iluvatar does what he wants. You might be inclined to interpret other magical events across the Legendarium as being the work of Iluvatar too, and certainly we may understand all of the magic of Arda as being in some way derived from Iluvatar's divine power. Personally, I take a less is more approach. I think the story is simply more interesting if we assume that Iluvatar is personally taking as little direct action as possible. There's a real, God of the gaps thing happening here. The more we understand, the smaller the areas of our ignorance get, and those areas are labeled God, or Iluvatar in this case. So that's divine magic and is unique. The second type of magic, then, is craft, or enchantment, and I might speculate that this is the most common form of magic that we see in Tolkien's work. The underlying idea here is that each individual, each artist, each creator is possessed of some personal power, and that power can be poured into the objects we create for good or ill. The Rings of Power are perhaps the most obvious examples, but I think we see the same thing all across the Legendarium at all sorts of scales. The Trees of Valinor, the Silmarils famously, the Swanboats of Alqualonde, the Palantiri, the File and the Mirror of Galadriel, the Elven Brooches and the Rope, swords like Glamdring and Orcrist and Anguirel and Anglichel and Sting and Anduril, Flame of the West. I think you can certainly argue that Lembas falls into this category, as well as Mirovar, the elf cordial. There's a degree of skill involved in the creation of the object, and the object then possesses a share of the power of the craftsperson. Usually this is reflected in an excellence of type, like a measure of quality. Anduril doesn't really have powers per se, it's just a really, really good sword. Lembas is similarly really, really good bread. The rings, and to a lesser or greater extent the Silmarils, seem to grant their bearer a measure of the nature and the power of their creators, but that's a complicated subject, perhaps best suited to another time. The idea of magical items, of course, perfectly matches with Tolkien's thoughts on subcreation. His stories are absolutely another kind of enchantment. The third type of magic might be thought of as lore, as knowledge, as prophecy, as words of truth and deceit. When Aragorn shows up at the Pelennor Fields and is reunited with Éomer, he says, quote, "Thus we meet again, though all the hosts of Mordor lay between us. Did I not say so at the Hornburg?" "So you spoke," said Éomer, "but hope oft deceives, and I knew not then that you were a man foresighted." End quote. Prophecy is, of course, all over the place in Tolkien's work, from the huge, stately, formal prophecies of the Witch King of Angmar and Boromir's Dream and Malbeth's prophecy of the Paths of the Dead and the Oathbreakers and the prophecy of Huan the Hound and the visions seen in Galadriel's mirror, to those glimpses of foresight that characters often have, particularly when those characters are near death. Feanor's understanding that the Noldor will never cast down Thangordrim, for example, or Gandalf telling Thorin to take Bilbo to Erebor because he is explicitly foresighted, or, honestly, like half of what Aragorn says. I'm connecting these ideas of foresightedness and lore because I think they share a quality of true speaking. They may not come from an intellectual understanding of one's circumstances, but they are, in a sense, made true by the speaking of them. Consider Gandalf's words to Theoden, which rouse him from the influence of Saruman and Wormtongue, or his words to Bill the pony before the Fellowship goes into Moria. Quote, "Go with words of guard and guiding on you," he said. "You are a wise beast and have learned much in Rivendell. Make your ways to places where you can find grass, and so come in time to Elrond's house, or wherever you wish to go." End quote. Or, better yet, of course, and perhaps more importantly, more famously, certainly, Gandalf's confrontation with Saruman at Orthanc. Quote, "He raised his hand and spoke slowly in a clear, cold voice. 'Saruman, your staff is broken.' There was a crack, and the staff split asunder in Saruman's hand, and the head of it fell down at Gandalf's feet. 'Go,' said Gandalf, End quote. Gandalf speaks, and the staff breaks, almost in recognition of the fact that Gandalf has asserted that it is already broken. It seems to me to be a kind of true speaking more than an outright spell. In fact, that entire scene is a masterclass of this type of magic, the power of flattery and manipulation and command and authority, but that is another conversation for another day. For now, this category of magic might be thought of as the power of words over the world. The fourth category of magic can be found in the natural world, if that's not a contradiction in terms. This is the magic of the landscape, of animals. This is the will of the wisps in the dead marshes, and perhaps the unusual sight granted to Frodo at the top of Amon Hen and the enchanted river of Mirkwood. This is arguably Old Man Willow, arguably the Barrow-wights, arguably Goldberry and Tom Bombadil himself. The thrushes at the end of The Hobbit, both the thrush of the prophecy and the one that talks to Bard. Beorn, possibly Huan, for sure. Some of those examples are probably going to strike you as clearly belonging to a different group, but that's okay. The boundaries are soft, particularly when it comes to this category, and there's certainly some overlap. Finally, with most of the magic of Middle-earth accounted for, we have to acknowledge that there are also spells. There is also thaumaturgy. There are supernatural means of manipulating the world, magic in the D&D sense. And it's often observed that there's far less explicit magic in Tolkien's work than many of the authors who followed in his footsteps. And that's true, but the consequence of that observation being repeated for 75 years is that when you go looking, there's actually a surprising amount of straight-up spellcasting. I won't go into an exhaustive list, and even if I did, there are some that are ambiguous enough that we would have to put them into another category entirely, such as the ventriloquism act that we get with the trolls in The Hobbit, but we unambiguously get numerous glowing lights and sparks and flashes and fires, including the bursting into flame of the arrow that Legolas unwisely fires at the newly resurrected Gandalf the White. So, spells, in this sense, seem to be the product of some conscious act. They are a thing that Gandalf knows how to do, and then he does it. At the West Gate of Moria, for example, he says, quote, "I once knew every spell in all the tongues of elves or men or orcs that was ever used for such a purpose. I can still remember 10 score of them without searching in my mind." End quote. So there's a degree of study, perhaps more than just an innate ability, certainly, and a degree of praxis, which opens up whole new areas of speculation regarding the development of this kind of utility magic. Who's the first person who learns how to do this? Gandalf isn't the only spellcaster that we can observe. Of course, one of my favorite examples comes from the end of the Siege of Gondor. Quote, "Then the black captain rose in his stirrups and cried aloud in a dreadful voice, speaking in some forgotten tongue words of power and terror to rend both heart and stone. Thrice he cried, thrice the great ram boomed. And suddenly upon the last stroke the gate of Gondor broke. As if stricken by some blasting spell, it burst asunder. There was a flash of searing lightning, and the doors tumbled in riven fragments to the ground." End quote. Which, pretty good moment, Witch King of Angmar. That's one on the board for you. Too bad that you are about to get swallowed by a prophecy loophole. So, 5 categories of magic: divine, enchantment, lore, natural, and good old-fashioned spellcasting. But that's not all there is to magic in Tolkien's world, because within the frame of Arda, that is, excluding the divine magic of Iluvatar, none of the categories that I've described are inherently good or bad. There are positive and negative examples in each category, and this is intentional, as we can tell from what Galadriel says in the chapter, The Mirror of Galadriel. Quote, "For this is what your folk would call magic, I believe, though I do not understand clearly what they mean, and they seem also to use the same word of the deceits of the enemy." End quote. So magic isn't, to the elves at least, otherworldly. It isn't a breaking of the rules of Arda, but rather a product of those rules. It's as natural as the elves themselves. As Tolkien notes in letter 155, it's a matter of motives. He also distinguishes between what he calls magia, physical magic, and goetia, which is conjuring magic or charm magic. Magia is traditionally thought of as being good, and goetia as being bad, but as Tolkien writes, quote, "Neither is in this tale good or bad per se, but only by motive or purpose or use. Both sides use both, but with different motives. The supremely bad motive is, for this tale, since it is specifically about it, domination of other free wills. The enemy's operations are by no means all goetic deceits, but magic that produces real effects in the physical world. But his magia he uses to bulldoze both people and things, and his goetia to terrify and subjugate." End quote. More, by the way, on that supremely bad motive, that domination of other free wills, in just a moment. It's this complexity. It's this understanding that evil is not a force or a power unto itself, but rather a corruption that twists every force, every power to darkness, that leaves us with such a rich text. A text which is, like all the best fairy tales and fantasy stories, suffused with magic that is compelling and memorable, and yet never quite wholly within our grasp. This week, I was lucky enough to receive a couple of fascinating questions from listeners to my Silmarillion series over at Stars and Swords, available now at starsandswords.com. The first comes from the wonderful Andrea, who writes, quote, "Can you talk a bit more about domination from a philosophical perspective? It is a major theme which I was thinking about as it pertains to Iluvatar and the Valar. It seems the lack of frequent intervention is connected to the primacy of the people of Middle-earth's agency versus someone more powerful intervening. So the Valar need to be asked to intercede and don't just do it on their own." End quote. And I think, Andrea, that you are completely right. At the highest level, free will is built into this universe right from the beginning. From the music of the Ainur, we are told that each of the spirits created by Iluvatar is free to contribute to the theme, to improvise, or to keep quiet. It's up to them. This is true, too, according to most scholars, of the elves and the men and the dwarves of Middle-earth. In fact, the desire to dominate others and deny their free will is presented to us, as in the letter that I read previously, as being axiomatically evil. We're told of Melkor, quote, "But he desired rather to subdue to his will both elves and men, envying the gifts with which Iluvatar promised to endow them, and he wished himself to have subjects and servants, and to be called lord, and to be a master over other wills." End quote. This is the heart of all evil in Arda, the desire to dominate others. This is true of Melkor, it's true of Sauron, it's true of Saruman, it's true of Lotho Sackville Baggins, the so-called chief of the new Shire order. The importance of free will is central to Tolkien's work for, it seems to me, two reasons. The first is that free will is obviously extremely important to Tolkien himself, who started out as a kind of small government libertarian and wound up as a self-described anarchist. Within the frame of the fiction, though, I think that free will stems from the central metaphor of the Ainulindalë, the Song of the Ainur, which is arguably the central metaphor of the entire piece. Iluvatar creates other beings so that they might cooperate, they might harmonize, they might enrich each other, and thus be more beautiful than any one might be alone. This is the heart of the project. This is the whole idea. So in one sense, dominating others is wrong because you are denying their quite literally God-given purpose, their autonomy. Domination is antithetical to the will of Iluvatar, and so is, kind of axiomatically, foundationally evil. This we can trace back to early Greek ideas, I think, about free will and autonomy. For Plato and Aristotle, the ideal human life is one of self-sufficiency, one of autonomy, to be independently ruled by one's own reason. And there's an argument here that will be picked up later by Immanuel Kant that because we cannot know the outcomes of our actions in a moral sense, the morality of any act is therefore found exclusively in the intention, not in the result. This is deontological ethics, in which you are judged for why you did what you did and not what actually happened as a result. It's good that you told the truth when your partner asked if you liked their shirt, because telling the truth is good. It is not your fault that the shirt was ugly. In this sense, domination of others is particularly wrong. It's specifically wrong in that you are taking away their locus of moral authority. You are denying the only power they have, their intention, to make good or bad choices, and that's the only thing we've got. That's what makes us human. This can be extended still further by combining it with Kant's categorical imperative, right? The idea that a moral action is one which you might wish that everyone would take. In its simplest form, it's parsable as treat other people the way that you want to be treated yourself. So, don't dominate the will of others unless you want someone to dominate your will in return. So dominating others removes the moral agency of that dominated person for good or bad, and also reduces diversity and the opportunity for cooperation and harmony. And to turn our attention from Kant and the philosophers of ancient Greece back to Tolkien, this brings us to a passage from Morgoth's Ring entitled, appropriately enough, Notes on Motives in the Silmarillion. Tolkien first clarifies that no one, not even Manwë, can read minds, or Technically he can, but he won't. Quote, "It is thus a temptation to minds of greater power to govern or constrain the will of other and weaker minds, so as to induce or force them to reveal themselves. But to force such a revelation or to induce it by any lying or deception, even for supposedly good purposes, including the good of the person so persuaded or dominated, is absolutely forbidden. To do so is a crime, and the good in the purposes of those who commit this crime swiftly becomes corrupted." End quote. All of which is to say, Andrea, that I agree, asking for help, whether successfully in the case of Eärendil or apparently unsuccessfully in the case of Elendil's dad, Amandil, asking for help isn't just a means of showing respect and deference and maintaining the social order. It's not supplicative. It's not humbling yourself. It's actually much more important because what it allows for is help while preserving the moral agency of at least the representative of those that you are helping. Eärendil chooses to take this action. He chooses to open this door, and then the Valar can choose to step through it without even inadvertently dominating Eärendil's will. It is perhaps another question entirely whether Eärendil really has the right to negotiate on behalf of all the elves and men of Beleriand, though perhaps given his parentage and his willingness to take the punishment for going to Valinor on himself, perhaps he does. I mean, if not him, it would be Gil-galad, who's High King, and I think we've all seen that Gil-galad is not going to accomplish anything in the First Age. I will note that in that passage in Morgoth's Ring, the Notes on Motives in the Silmarillion, Tolkien is completely clear that the intervention from the Valar wasn't late or reluctant, but in fact occurred at the perfect time. In fact, I'm just going to read this passage. I think this is great. Quote, "The last intervention with physical force by the Valar ending in the breaking of Thangorodrim may then be viewed as not in fact reluctant or even unduly delayed, but timed with precision. The intervention came before the annihilation of the Eldar and the Edain. Morgoth, though locally triumphant, had neglected most of Middle-earth during the war, and by it he had in fact been weakened. In power and prestige he had lost and failed to recover one of the Silmarils, and above all in mind. He had become absorbed in kingship, and though a tyrant of ogre size and monstrous power, this was a vast fall even from his former wickedness of hate and his terrible nihilism. He had fallen to like being a tyrant king with conquered slaves and vast obedient armies. The war was successful, and ruin was limited to the small, if beautiful, region of Beleriand." End quote, which has... I mean, wow, that is a lot to think about, and that is probably a topic for a future show because, yeah, Tolkien is saying a lot in that passage. Thank you so much for the question, Andrea. I really enjoyed delving into that a little bit. I also have a question from Nick, who is leading me just a little off topic, but I can't resist the bait, quite frankly. Nick writes, quote, "In the bloody aftermath of the War of the Rohirrim and the Rings of Power, I have to ask, even considering the original Jackson trilogy, does Tolkien have the worst history of adaptations of any fantasy author?" End quote. So on the one hand, Nick, I see what you're doing. I know what you're looking for here, and you're going to get it, but not today. We will have an opportunity to talk in the future about both the War of the Rohirrim and the Rings of Power in full, but I don't necessarily want to reveal my feelings on either subject in advance, or at least reveal my feelings about the 2 episodes of Rings of Power that I have seen so far. The larger answer, the more important answer, is absolutely not. Tolkien, pound for pound, is doing just fine adaptation-wise. Compare, if you will, all the many adapted works of Tolkien against the adapted works of my beloved Ursula K. Le Guin's Earthsea novels. There was a mid-90s BBC radio adaptation with Judi Dench, which was terrible. There was a 2004 Sci-Fi Channel miniseries, which is awful in like a dozen different ways, before you get to the fact that Earthsea is a series absolutely full of people of color, and the cast of the miniseries was, well, as Le Guin put it herself, "I have blasted them for whitewashing Earthsea and do not forgive them for it." End quote. It is both a terrible piece of adaptation and a god-awful series in its own right, and what is amazing, what is breathtaking, is that it's not the worst adaptation of Earthsea, thanks to the 2006 Studio Ghibli movie Tales from Earthsea, directed by Goro Miyazaki, which is an incomprehensible, unrecognizable mess of an adaptation, which also independently and by its own standards, standing on its own 2 feet, sucks. All of which is to say that I'm grateful for the Tolkien adaptations that we've got, because they could have been much worse. Maybe not the Battle of the Five Armies. Maybe that is about as bad as it can possibly get. But again, a conversation for another time. Thank you, Nick. If you, dear listener, have questions or queries, then please do get in touch. You can find Shire Reckoning Pod on your social media app of choice. as long as your social media app of choice is either Instagram or Blue Sky. You can leave a comment on the YouTube page, or you can email me directly, shirereckoningpod@gmail.com. All of the podcasts that I do are supported by the Next Word Patreon at, appropriately enough, patreon.com/nextword. And if you like listening to podcasts without ads for sports gambling websites or soup delivery services, then please consider heading over there and pledging your support. You are the only reason that I get to do this work, and every dollar gets turned directly into podcasts. One last announcement. On Tuesday at 9 p.m. Central, we will have the second installment of our live seminar series on The Hobbit, and we're going to actually get to the text and our introduction to Bilbo Baggins of Bag End. The first session was a lot of fun. I hope you'll be able to join me. Check out youtube.com/@ShireReckoningPod. I'll see you there. And so we come toward the end of the show. This week, not much is happening in Arda. As I said last time, the summer months are slow in Middle-earth. Boromir is still a long way from Rivendell, and Gandalf is going to be stranded atop Orthanc for at least a while longer. In real-world history, however, this week sees the anniversary of one of the most important and, particularly lately, often quoted of Tolkien's letters. On the 25th of July, 1938, in response to an inquiry from the German publisher Ruten and Learning Verlag regarding a German-language translation of The Hobbit and Tolkien's Aryanness, Tolkien replied, quote, "If I am to understand that you are inquiring whether I am of Jewish origin, I can only reply that I regret I appear to have no ancestors of that gifted people. My great-great-grandfather came to England in the 18th century from Germany. The main part of my descent is therefore purely English, and I am an English subject, which should be sufficient. I have been accustomed, nonetheless, to regard my German name with pride, and continue to do so throughout the period of the late regrettable war in which I served in the English army. I cannot, however, forbear to comment that if impertinent and irrelevant inquiries of this sort are to become the rule in matters of literature, then the time is not far distant when a German name will no longer be a source of pride." End quote. And I think that I speak for all of us when I say, get 'em. This last week saw the publication of Verlin Flieger's new book, A Real Taste for Fairy Stories, and if, of course, you're interested at all in Tolkien scholarship, then you'll recognize Professor Flieger's name and probably the title of her absolutely foundational 1983 book, Splintered Light. The new book contains essays covering, and I'm quoting from her publisher's website here, the status, structure, and meaning of Tolkien's work for a 21st century audience. I'm reluctantly holding off on ordering my own copy in case they release a digital version, which is just extremely convenient for my ever-growing Tolkien collection, but my ability to resist temptation is a long way from infinite. So when I inevitably pick it up, I will let you know what I think. The blog Thoughts on Tolkien published this week a piece entitled The Horn and the Sword, looking at Pippin and Denethor and what is at stake for Aragorn's claim to the throne. It is a strong analysis of a section of the text that I think most readers read rather quickly. Highly recommended. The link to all of these, of course, is in the show notes. And lastly, for this week, there is a new Tolkien-influenced cocktail bar inside an escape room in San Francisco. It's called Lore. Maybe the future is going to be okay after all. That's it for this week. I'll be back on Tuesday with our next live discussion, the first chapter of The Hobbit, and next Sunday with an all-new show. Get in touch if you have questions or comments, Shire Reckoning Pod in all of the places, and please help drive back the shadow by leaving a rating or a review wherever you're listening to this, or, go to Lore in San Francisco and order a cocktail and tell somebody sitting at the bar about this podcast. That's not efficient marketing, but it is very, very focused. That'll do it for this week. Until next time, thank you so much for listening.